All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Sorry for the brief hiccup there. You spend all this time getting your technology ready, and then right before you go live, it decides that it is not going to work. So we had to take a step back and fix a few things, but we are back and we are live. Well, thank you for joining us on our Tuesday afternoon weekly Facebook Lives. I'm Pete Miele, Executive Director of Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. We're coming to you each and every Tuesday afternoon with interesting stories and interpretations in the areas of race, religion, medicine, and war from the 19th century and beyond. As we wait for people to log on, talk a little bit about what we have coming up over the next week, and as we get to the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, we have some exciting stuff planned for you coming up. Starting on this Friday, we're going to be beginning our Beyond the Ridge series. We went out last week and filmed some videos on location from interesting and less visited sites that are important to the Gettysburg campaign leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg, but generally aren't visited or get left out. So we have some exciting videos that are going to be posted on the anniversary of the events that we are talking about. So that is going to start this Friday, June 26th. We're going to be looking at the Caledonia Iron Furnace out towards Chambersburg. Also on Friday at 5 p.m., we have our monthly Zoom History Happy Hour for our members. So if you are a member of Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, first of all, we thank you for supporting our important work, but we also have been doing these Zoom History Happy Hours. And Dr. Darrell Black, our president, and I will be back in this building talking about the hospitals and what was going on in Civil War hospitals during and after the Battle of Gettysburg, and in Civil War hospitals all over. I'm just going to pick up my phone here, which dropped. And then next Tuesday afternoon, we're going to be talking about the eve of battle. June 30th, we're going to be talking about what was going on in Gettysburg on that day. Dr. Darrell Black and I will be broadcasting from the cupola 2 stories above me right now. And then next Wednesday, I think the first is a Wednesday, we have a full slate of live videos from inside this building and on the ground around us talking about the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. So we hope that you will join us for all of those. We will be posting links to these videos and reminders on our Facebook page as we get closer to the event. If you like what you see, we ask that you join and support us. We can't do this important work without the help of our friends out there. And if you do like it and share it on Facebook. Let your friends know the exciting things that you are seeing on Facebook during this time. As you can see, I am back in Seminary Ridge Museum today, an appropriate backdrop for the stories that we're going to be talking about, the book that we're going to be talking about. This is not a fancy Zoom background. This is actually me in Seminary Ridge Museum. We did just reopen after being closed for almost exactly 3 months. We reopened Seminary Ridge Museum on June 13th. So we are open Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday now. So if you would like, please, you can buy tickets online, and we hope that you'll come back and see us up here on the Ridge. So we are going to be talking about a very important book today. I saw Jeff, our good friend Jeff, mentioned that it is his favorite book. I did bring along my well-worn copy of Colors of Courage that I bought when I first moved to Gettysburg here in 2013. And we're going to be kind of walking through this book and talking a little bit about the important stories that it tells and how it contributes to the overall understanding of the Gettysburg campaign, the Battle of Gettysburg, and maybe most importantly, the aftermath and the remembrance of Gettysburg. So the book is called Colors of Courage, Gettysburg's Forgotten History, Immigrants, Women, and African Americans in the Civil War's Defining Battle. And the author is Margaret S. Creighton. She is a professor of history up at Bates College in Maine. The book was published in 2005 by Basic Books. It's still in print. and James McPherson, the eminent professor at emeritus at Princeton University, called it a genuinely new and important material when it first came out in 2005. And what this book does is that it gets away from the martial, the fighting aspects of the Battle of Gettysburg, and instead chooses to focus on sort of the characters around, the historical actors around the margins of the battle and of the Gettysburg campaign. And it really tells stories of ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. And how did they respond? Why did they respond in the ways that they responded? And Creighton questions this dominant narrative that we all hear about the Civil War, about the fighting that goes on. And the fighting is important, don't get me wrong. I'm looking out the window right now at Seminary Ridge, and there's important fighting that goes on there. But what are those stories that tend to be left in the shadows? So she's trying here to expand the boundaries of the battle and draw in a more inclusive understanding of what goes on here in South Central Pennsylvania in June, July, August, and even beyond of 1863. So the book is structured in 3 parts. The first part talks about life for some of these groups of people before the battle. She goes through the 3 days of the battle and how each of these 3 groups were affected. And then she spends a lot of time towards the end of the book, and I'm going to focus on this pretty significantly today, is the analysis of the aftermath of the battle and the parts that each of these 3 groups played. And then she also spends a lot of time talking about how we remember the Battle of Gettysburg and how the stories of these groups were, again, left out of that dominant narrative. And Creighton's book is doing a good job trying to bring, and again, the book is, gosh, now 15 years old, and we think about these groups of people, these historical actors, when we talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. And I think that a lot of that is due in part to Creighton's book. So I think that it did ultimately, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, it ultimately did what it set out to do and bring some of these stories back into the mainstream. So the first group that I want to focus on here, and what's interesting about Seminary Ridge Museum, and we're not going to necessarily take a walk through Seminary Ridge Museum today. I invite you to do that on your own. But one of the interesting things that I've realized over the last year is that each of the 3 floors of exhibits here in Seminary Ridge Museum covers one of the groups of people, or spends time looking at one of the groups of people that Creighton talks about: immigrants, women, and African Americans. So if you come in, you'll see the stories and see some artifacts from people that Creighton is talking about. So it's a really interesting overlap between the book and what you see here. But we're going to start by talking about immigrants, people primarily from Germany who are going to come and fight in the American Civil War. And up here on the 4th floor of the museum, we have a facsimile of the commission of Alexander Schimmelpfennig, who is a division commander on the first day of the battle, division commander in the 11th Corps. We'll talk a little bit about him, but stepping back and looking at what's going on with immigrants and the immigrant movement in the years leading up to the Civil War, because it's important to look back at the 1840s and 50s and what's going on and how that's affecting how people from Europe are being viewed during the Civil War. In the 1840s and 50s, there's a large outbreak of anti-Irish, anti-German sentiment. This is the time of the nativist movement. We have to be more concerned about people who are native-born Americans and people from Europe, these Germans and these Irish who are coming over in large populations in the 1840s and 50s, primarily Catholics, and against these Puritan sensibilities on which America had been seemingly founded. So there is a backlash against these people, and this is going to come to play also during the war. immigrants could vote quickly, and it was showing, and this bothered a lot of people. Again, there's an anti-Catholic, anti-papist movement that's going on in America, and people that are coming over from Europe tended to not be a big fans of the temperance movement that was growing in America at the time. So these immigrants, and I'll talk primarily about German immigrants because that's what factors into what's going on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, are joining, moving into these communities like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that's where we see Carl Schurz, who's probably the most, maybe the most famous, at least the second or third most famous German immigrant Civil War commander. And Carl Schurz comes over here from, looking at my notes here, comes over here from Germany. He's a veteran of the failed revolutions in Germany of 1848. He comes to the United States in 1852, settles in Wisconsin, and becomes a community leader, and becomes, he's been fighting his whole life in Germany for civil rights and social equality, and he comes to America and he sees the institution of slavery, and he becomes a vehement opponent of slavery, and joins the Republican Party, the new party, the party of Lincoln, that's fighting for some of these reforms, especially the anti-slavery movement, and that's why he's going to war. Carl Schurz believes that when he goes off to war and he's fighting against the institution of slavery. Another German immigrant that is joins up from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is a man named Bernhard Domschke, and he is a prominent newspaper editor there up in Milwaukee. But he's a really interesting figure because in 1854, he drafts something called the Louisville Platform. And the Louisville Platform denounced all racial and class privileges, attacked slavery and the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and advocated free lands for settlers, easier and quicker naturalization procedures, and equal political and social rights for Blacks and women. So this is really forward-thinking, much more forward-thinking than a lot of people wanted to go. The Louisville Platform never really gets off the ground, but these are the people that are joining the Army, the United States Army, and it shows what they have at stake in the fighting here. Let's talk a little bit about our friend Alexander Schimmelpfennig, who's got maybe the most interesting name of soldiers in the Army of the Potomac during the Civil War, and it's actually his name that results in him receiving the commission, the facsimile of which that we have upstairs. So Alexander Schimmelpfennig, again, like Carl Schurz, is one of those revolutionaries from Europe in the 1840s. He comes to America after the revolutions fail, and he lands in Philadelphia, and he starts working for the War Department, eventually joins the Army. And the story goes that in 1862, President Lincoln is looking down a list of names of people that he thinks, the list of names of possible people to promote. And he's standing there with Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, and Lincoln looks and sees the name Schimmelpfennig. And he says, I want that man to be elevated to brigadier general. And Edwin Stanton says, there are something along the lines of, there are more qualified people that deserve to be promoted, better military minds. And Lincoln says, no, something needs to be done in the interest of the Dutch, and to that I want Schimmelpfennig promoted. So Lincoln, the shrewd politician that he was, recognized that by promoting somebody like Alexander Schimmelpfennig, that this would get more and more people of German descent to join the ranks of the Union Army, and recognized that that was a recruiting tool. So that is the story of how Alexander Schimmelpfennig receives his commission. Schimmelpfennig is serving under Schurz at the Battle of Chancellorsville in May of 1863, and Schurz's men are the ones that bear the brunt of Stonewall Jackson's famous flank maneuver there in Chancellorsville. And the men who break and run in the 11th Corps get the moniker the Flying Dutchman. Already, as we mentioned, sentiment against Germans and Irish and immigrants in general is very low. And then we look and we see these cowardly German, as the newspapers of the day might put it, these cowardly Germans dropping their arms and running away in the face of the overwhelming Confederate arms. So as these men are marching into Gettysburg in the summer of 1863, they have a reputation of being cowards and a reputation of being looked down upon. And Alexander Schimmelpfennig, again, is at the head of these men, and he's going to go out with his men out to the plains of Gettysburg, north of Gettysburg College, on the first day of July 1863, and going to face an attack from Jubal Early's division coming down the Harrisburg Road, and also some of the attack of Robert Rhodes' division. And once again, these German soldiers of the 11th Corps are going to be forced to retreat. And Alexander Schimmelpfennig has a story that a lot of people know, as he is racing through the streets of Gettysburg with his men trying to get back to the safety of Cemetery Hill. He gets separated from his men and jumps over a fence from the alley over a fence into the backyard of a house on Baltimore Street. And as he tries to jump over the other fence onto Baltimore Street, he realizes that the Confederate Army has taken the street and there is nowhere to go. He crawls into a culvert in the property, and that is where he is going to spend the 3 days of battle. And Anna Garlich, who is a girl who lives in the home, tells the story later on about what happens to Alexander Schimmelpfennig. He's crawled into that wooden culvert, hurriedly crawled out of sight under this culvert. He remained there. Again, this is Anna's words. He remained there until after dark. It was night when my mother went out of the house, following the path to the stables for the purpose of feeding our hogs. Along the pathway was a woodshed. As mother went up, the general said, "Be quiet and do not say anything." He had taken the wood and built a shelter overhead to better hide himself. On the second day, mother made a pretense of going to the swill barrel to empty a bucket. In the bucket, however, was water and a piece of bread. And instead of going there to the barrel, they went to the general in hiding. So for 3 days, the Garlich family was feeding Alexander Schimmelpfennig. His men think that he has either been wounded, killed, or captured, and they are very surprised after the Confederates retreat from town that Alexander Schimmelpfennig shows back up within Union lines. But the press jumps on this story, and it's another example for them of the cowardice of German troops. Here is this general that spends 3 days hiding in a woodshed away from the Confederate Army. But Alexander Schimmelpfennig and the rest of the other Germans of the 11th Corps go on to have a very illustrious career. They get transferred to Sherman's army after the Battle of Gettysburg, and this is one of the columns that is going to lead Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. And Alexander Schimmelpfennig is actually the first Union general that is going to re-enter Charleston, South Carolina, as that city falls in 1865. And he actually becomes the general that accepts the city's surrender. But he does not live much longer after his term of service is up. He goes back to his home in Reading, Pennsylvania, and he dies of tuberculosis. Not long, I believe it's even as early as late 1865, Schimmelpfennig dies of tuberculosis. Unfortunate, caught this disease when he was in probably serving somewhere around the swamps of South Carolina. But that's the story of Alexander Schimmelpfennig, and and some of these soldiers of German descent that end up getting a sort of a bad name and are considered outsiders within the Army, in America in general. Let's take a stop here and see if there are any questions. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. We're going to be answering them during and after the presentation. So please answer any question, ask any questions that you might have. One particular figure who is both has the immigrant problems that she has to face, but is also a female, is a woman named Elizabeth Thorne. And Elizabeth Thorne is married to Peter Thorne, who is the caretaker of Evergreen Cemetery. They live in the gatehouse up on Cemetery Hill. And Elizabeth Thorne's story is interesting, and like all of the women who live here in Gettysburg, that they're living within this culture of domesticity, and that really defines what they can do and how they can act in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century brought about changes in domestic life, and as the 19th century, from the mid-19th century on, you start to see the outside of the home, the working world is a man's world, and everything inside of the house, cooking, cleaning, caring for children, is a woman's sphere. The woman's job is to raise children and make their home a haven of warmth and love for their men. And this culture of domesticity eventually is going to spill out beyond the home into some of these movements that we've already talked about a little bit, the abolition movement, the temperance movement, suffrage movement. Women are going to latch on to this idea of nurturing and morality and move that beyond the home. And as the Civil War breaks out, women are looking for a way to show their patriotism, show their support for the cause. This is something that some writers, newspaper people are latching onto as during the Civil War, is the fact that maybe are women being patriotic enough? So women, of course, they can't go to fight legally. They have to show some way that they support what's going on, support the war cause. Some of those ways are sewing, are scraping lint, sending care packages to the front. But a big way that this is shown is, and I just went dead apparently. Rob? I just got a text from our tech guy who says that we may have lost the feed. Okay, he says we're okay. Sorry about that, everybody. It's filming from a different spot than my normal sitting at home. So everybody, I'm seeing people comment. Thank you for saying, people are commenting in saying we're here, we can hear you. So thank you for that. Sorry about that. So women are joining the ranks of the nurses that are coming to Gettysburg. You can see right here behind me, we have a female nurse, a sister, a daughter of charity from Emmitsburg, Maryland. And just to talk a little bit about nursing during the Civil War here, this idea of nursing is not, and the jobs that women are performing here are not necessarily what we think about as nursing today. So we think about nurses, we think about what's going on inside of a hospital, in some cases helping with surgeries, helping with providing treatment, and that was certainly part of nursing, but this extended beyond that to feeding, to dressing, to preparing, to writing letters. And we can see as we look back here, we have a female nurse that is helping to feed a wounded soldier who probably can't feed himself. And again, this is an extension of that domestic ideology that we were talking about, that this would be something that a female might be doing in the home, feeding or writing letters. And that's what they're doing as a part of this army experience. Of course, they're not part of the army, but they're within the sort of realm of the army. And I think we think a lot about the nurses, the women that helped care for wounded soldiers right here in the seminary hospital. We have somebody like Mary Ziegler, who is the matron of the seminary. She lives here in the building with her children, her 5 children, and her husband, Emmanuel. And her son, Hugh, writes about the duties that she takes on when the Ziegler family returns to this building after the battle. Hugh said, "My mother took charge of the kitchen and did the cooking and was hailed by the wounded and others connected with the hospital as mother." So they're even calling her in that sort of domestic sphere, using the term of endearment that might be used in that domestic sphere. Sarah Broadhead is another fascinating figure who shows up here at the seminary. Sarah Broadhead lives down in Gettysburg. She is a mother. Her husband works for the railroad, and Sarah keeps a diary for the month from June 15th, 1863 until July 15th, 1863. And it provides a really great snapshot of life in Gettysburg and some of the emotions that people are feeling as the Confederate Army makes its way up the Cumberland Valley, crosses over the Mason-Dixon line here into Pennsylvania, and starts making its way towards Gettysburg. And we're fortunate enough, Sarah Broadhead kept this diary, and then the diary was published. 200 copies, original copies, were published as a fundraiser for the Sanitary Commission. And in fact, right above where my camera is, I can see in one of our display cases one of those 200 copies that we have on display. So I invite you someday to come and see it. Sarah Broadhead is helping feed wounded soldiers, is helping clean wounded soldiers. She has to get a bucket and help wash wounds. And one of the other really important duties that I made mention of before was the idea of writing letters home. And Lydia Ziegler, who is a 12-year-old girl living here in the seminary building, she's Mary Ziegler's daughter, talks about taking a pen and paper and going around and writing the last letters that soldiers will ever dictate, writing them home. So that's what she is doing at that age, and it stays with her for the rest of her life. What she has to do to help these men gain some semblance of comfort. So, excuse me. In some cases, surgeons, other male medical staff were not very fond of having females come and help out in hospitals. It was unknown how a woman would react to seeing blood. It was unknown how a woman would react to seeing the male body, having to clean the male body. And in one group of women that comes here to Gettysburg following the battle is the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster. And it's a relief group from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, about 60 miles east of here. And their president is a woman named Rosina Hubley. And in fact, again, I can look right above my camera and I can see a letter that Rosina Hubley wrote to Governor Andrew Curtin right as the Battle of Gettysburg ended, about bringing supplies here to Gettysburg to help care for these wounded soldiers. But Rosina Hubley the Patriot Daughters write about their experiences here in Gettysburg, and they first serve at Christ Lutheran Church down on Chambersburg Street right after the battle. And she recalls, quote, "We did not think he, the surgeon, gave us a warm reception, perhaps having a prejudice against lady nurses. But eventually, as the women come in and start making sure that the men are clean and fluffing their pillows and changing their dressings, changing their bed sheets, they start to see the work that these women are doing and how important that is to the men's health. So a lot of these surgeons, even if they are skeptical at the beginning, it definitely comes across. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the Daughters of Charity for a moment. They are a group of nuns that come up from Emmitsburg, Maryland, only about 10 miles south of here. They spend a lot of time at different battlefields, and they come here right after the battle to help care for wounded soldiers. There are somewhere either 4 or 5 that actually serve here in this hospital, caring for wounded soldiers. And that's more of a structured group. Some of these women, like Sarah Broadhead, Mary Ziegler, Lydia Ziegler, it's more of an unstructured, they're helping out where needed. But there's also more of the structured setting, like with Dorothea Dix, recruiting nurses that are working really within the confines of the medical military hierarchy, whereas some are just kind of showing up and helping out where needed. But all of this, as I mentioned earlier, is an extension of that domestic sphere. The women are doing work and performing duties here in the Civil War, showing their patriotism in a way that keeps them sort of within that structure that they had been used to and had been performing leading up to the war. One of the things that Margaret Creighton talks about is, their story up to a certain point. The story of women had generally been left out of Gettysburg, and I can think in Evergreen Cemetery today, of course, there is now a statue of Elizabeth Thorne. She spends the days and weeks after the battle. She's 6 months pregnant, and she spends the days and weeks after the battle helping to bury wounded soldiers there in the cemetery. And there's a statue to her now, but I can't off the top of my head really think about another acknowledgement, a statue to a female who serves here at Gettysburg. But as we can see, that they perform a very important duty. And one of the other things that Margaret Creighton says is all of this focus on the battle and the martial heroics, the courage that the men face. And then and this may be true when Creighton wrote her book, but not necessarily true now, we tend to forget about that aftermath. And there are some really good books out right now, like Strange and Blighted Land, that talk about the aftermath. But that point where the women are really doing their work has been left out of that dominant narrative. But I would say now is starting to get some attention. The last group that Margaret Creighton talks about are African Americans. And Gettysburg and Cumberland Township, which surrounds Gettysburg to the northwest and east and northwest and south, has vibrant pockets of African American community during the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. They live in this area. They are accepted by the white population here in Gettysburg, but there is definitely adversity that they have to face. And Creighton talks about the insults in newspapers. I'll talk about that in just a moment. And a powerful legal system that is basically stacked against them that they have to contend with. Some of the African Americans in the community have gained a sense of independence, have become landowners, men like Abraham Bryan, who lives down right by the angle there, the climax of Pickett's charge. But by and large, they are working in homes as laundresses, they're cleaning houses, they're working as hired hands, skilled, maybe some skilled labor. So kind of run that gamut from being subservient and having to work under white people, but also some people have again gained that independence. But one of the big things that Creighton talks about here is about how Gettysburg and Adams County are really that fault line. We're only 8 miles from the Mason-Dixon line, and in the years leading up to the Civil War, this white people could go across the border without really having to think about it. But for African Americans, this was a really big chasm, and she uses that word chasm. I've adopted it as well. Because this is the border between slavery and freedom. And as African Americans, enslaved people are self-emancipating coming north across the border, there are also people that are coming over the border. There's a reverse underground railroad in slave catchers that are coming and capturing free African Americans and pulling them south into slavery. And one of the best known stories that Creighton retells here in her book is about Mag Palm, who is working as a laundress in town for a family. And one night in 1858, she gets held up at work. Some people say that her employer maybe was involved and complicit in what was going to happen. And Mag Palm, as she's leaving her employer's house to go back home south of town, 2 men jump out of an alley and try to bind her and gag her. And they're going to force her into a wagon and bring her south into Maryland, or maybe even further. And Mag Palm is pretty big. As the newspapers say, she possesses more than ordinary muscular strength, and she is able to fight these men off, even biting off one of their thumbs. So she was one of the people that was able to resist this attempt to enslave her. But there are other stories, like with Catherine Payne in Bendersville, and she and her children are kidnapped and dragged south into slavery in 1845. So it's not just this narrative of triumphant escaping from slavery. There's also another story, another less known story, and even the Confederate Army, as Albert Gallatin Jenkins and his cavalry are riding up through the Cumberland Valley during the Gettysburg campaign, right about now, 157 years ago. They are capturing free African Americans and selling them south into slavery. So this is happening all the way up through the Civil War, all the way up through 1863. And Creighton spends considerable time talking about that. As the Confederate invasion of Gettysburg really gets underway, the African American community here in Gettysburg, and it's that vibrant, really sort of supportive community, has to either hide or flee. Basil Biggs, who is a farmer who lives west of town, he rents land. There's a very well-known story, and it's published in his obituary in 1906, about how he stays here in Gettysburg right until the last minute, and he has the first wave of Confederates under Jubal Early come through on June 26th. He jumps on his horse, rides east to York, and that's where he spends the battle. He comes home, and his farm and his barn have been ruined. His crops have been trampled, and Basil Biggs has to take a job leading the team that is going to exhume and rebury bodies at the National Cemetery up to and even after Lincoln dedicates the National Cemetery in November of 1863. There were African Americans in this community that did want to join and help put down the rebellion. Randolph Johnson, who's one of those community leaders, has been drilling a company of men, and he wants to offer them to Governor Andrew Creighton to help stem the tide of invasion. There were Governor Andrew Creighton, as the invasion takes place, Creighton tries to raise men, emergency men, to help put down and help defend communities. And Randolph Johnson has about 50 men that want to make their service known, and Andrew Creighton, in fact, turns them down. One of the newspapers in Gettysburg, and this sort of gets at that kind of these insults in newspapers that African Americans in Gettysburg had to face. One of the newspapers that talks about Randolph Johnson's company said, "Let not the false prejudice of anyone say that these blacks have no right to take part in this war, since we know that for every black man who goes, a white one will be left at home." So yes, they can go and they can help fight and defend their homeland, but it's for the benefit of whites, because if we send these African Americans, that means that less white people will have to go. So it's sort of that underhanded explanation that is put forth by some of these Gettysburg newspapers. Between the 1880s and the early 1900s, Gettysburg was a destination for African Americans. It was seen as a mecca of freedom, and it's not until the national parks, or the War Department, the federal government, takes over the park and Confederate monuments start going up that you start to see a drop off in African Americans coming to Gettysburg. But up from the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, there were groups that would come up from Baltimore and Washington, D.C., recognizing what this area meant for freedom from slavery. And that's something that Margaret Creighton spends a good bit of time talking about, and how a lot of these stories are left out of that dominant narrative of the Battle of Gettysburg that we tend to all hear. So I do encourage you, at Seminary Ridge Museum, again, we spend a lot of time down on the second floor talking about the Underground Railroad, the anti-slavery movement in Adams County, and the 24th United States Colored Troops. Randolph Johnson eventually gets his wish, and his company is subsumed into the 24th Regiment of USCT, and go off and spend the last year of the war performing duties like guarding Confederate prisoners in Point Lookout, Maryland. So Johnson and his men eventually go to war, and when they come back, they form a society, the Sons of Goodwill, to help care for injured, wounded, sick veterans, and then also create and establish a cemetery where these men can rest. So I encourage you to read the book. First of all, I think that it has held up very well. A lot of the stories that Creighton tells are now have become part of more mainstream Gettysburg interpretation, but she still makes a lot of really good points and tells a lot of stories that really does that job of expanding the narrative, and really, if we look at just kind of the martial actions, the fighting and the battlefield, and then look out at what else is going on, and it has impacts even in the years beyond the war, and then even leading up to today. So it's a really good book. As I've been saying, Seminary Ridge Museum ties very closely into what's being told in this book. We have exhibits and artifacts that speak to some of what she says. So I invite you to come and join us to look at that. I'm going to see about questions here. I know we have a few. Did the Know Nothing Party get much support among the citizens of Gettysburg before the war? Jeff asks. Jeff, I'm just not too sure about that. I think that let me take a look at that and see, and I'll try to find an answer for you. I have not really read much about that, although a lot of my research is kind of just like the Lincoln 1860 election. So let me go back and look a little bit in the 1840s and 50s and see what I can find, see if there's anything else. Thanks a lot, Linda. We'll see you on Friday. Larry, Company A, 26th Regiment U.S. Emergency Infantry. Great to hear. A bunch of men who joined the 26th Emergency Militia come right here from the seminary, commanded by Frederick Kleinfelter, who's a seminary student here. So the seminary has a very close connection to the 26th. I talked about that a little bit in my talk 2 weeks ago. Well, we've reached the end of our time together. Thank you again for joining me on this Tuesday Facebook Live. Remember, we'll be back next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Talking about the eve of battle, broadcasting right up from the cupola there on top of this building. If you are a member, we invite you to join us on this Friday where we talk about the hospitals and changes in medical science during the Civil War. And then keep an eye out on our Facebook page and our website as we add videos and events in the next couple of weeks, in the next week, surrounding the anniversary. If you like this video, share it with your friends, like it, let them know about the exciting things that are happening at Seminary Ridge Museum. If you really like us, join and support. Allow us to keep doing videos like these, bringing important interpretations and stories from race, religion, medicine, and war to people young and old across the country. And we thank you, and we hope to see you up on the ridge soon.